We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's, minds that are to our minds as ours are to the beasts in the jungle.
Don't adjust your sets. You are welcome to the Irish side of the moon. Welcome and good evening. This is Irish Side of the Moon. My name is Gabriel Logue, and I'm speaking right now with Patricia McKenna. Patricia was a one-time member of the Green Party and an MEP. Now is a independent voice that she says people can trust. We're going to talk about the Lisbon Treaty because I have not a clue what it's about. I've tried to read it and it doesn't make any sense to me. I'm hoping, Patricia, that you can clue me in some of the details because I've tried to read it. So, Patricia, you're welcome and thank you for coming on the show. How are you?
Very well, Gabriel, thanks. And I suppose just on the Lisbon Treaty, saying it's difficult, you've tried to read it. The fact is that the Lisbon Treaty was made deliberately, as Amato, the Prime Minister of Italy, had said, deliberately incomprehensible, so that people wouldn't understand it and wouldn't be able to request referenda on it in other countries. So it was originally what was called the EU Constitution. It was rejected in referendums in the Netherlands and in France. And after those rejections, what they did was the heads of state, they took the EU Constitution back, and what they did was they chopped it up into a big list of amendments. They basically kept the whole text as has been openly admitted. It's the same thing, except what they did was they put it in a big long list of amendments, which were amendments to the existing EU treaties. So it's not a standalone document because you would have to have the treaties themselves as well to look at, well, this is an amendment to the existing treaties, how does it affect it? So you need, it would take a lot of work. I mean, we know this, I know this myself from experience because we've had to go through the thing with a fine-tooth comb and to go through the treaties and to check where everything applied, etc. And I suppose one of the most interesting things is that the Lisbon Treaty creates a new European Union, with a constitution as such, called something different, but it creates a new European Union, and I suppose the biggest change in it is in relation to the power base. The big states, up to now, each member state had a certain legal equality.
Okay.
But what they've done now is they've changed the voting system and they've based it on population criteria. So in other words, Germany with 80 million, it's huge compared to Ireland's tiny 4 million. Like we've got half our vote in the Council of Ministers, which is the most important decision-making body in Europe, and we go down to less than 1%. It's 0.8%. And Germany, it over doubles its current voting rate, and France, Italy and Britain, which have about 60 million per population each, all make a massive increase in their voting strength. So I think that's probably fundamentally one of the biggest things in relation to how the treaty itself, how it will affect the current situation as opposed to what will be in the future.
Okay, so what you're saying is that if we vote yes for the Lisbon Treaty, what you just said will come into play. Ireland will have a minimal voice in a sea of really loud voices.
That's correct. I mean, okay, there's a lot of other things as well. I mean, there's a huge number of areas in the Lisbon Treaty, and everything that was raised during the last referendum is still valid and still, genuine issues, because the treaty has not been changed one single iota, not one dot or comma has been moved in it. The only difference this time around will be that in relation to the loss of a commissioner, which we'd argued at the time anyway, that, you know, you can actually correct that without having to touch the treaties, which is what they've done, you know, because they changed the loss of a commissioner would have had to be a unanimous decision anyway.
Okay.
So what they've done now is they've actually allowed that the country that has the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, he would be considered as a commissioner as such, so that everyone in the EU will have somebody in the commission at any one time. But yeah, I mean, every issue, I suppose, that was raised last time will still be relevant this time. But I think probably the biggest issue, I suppose, is the whole change in the comparison between the big states and the small states.
Okay, so I listened to you very recently on a local radio station. I'm not going to give the name of the station. And you made a point on vote weighting, and which was what we just talked about. And the question was handed over to a local politician. Not only did he not address that one single point, he sidestepped and ended up using lateral movements to a position of, well, and I quote, I hear from my friends and family in Europe that Ireland is being laughed at and there is much fear for the Irish. And I was wondering, what has that got to do with vote weighting? So that's what made me go, okay, I heard what you were saying. I thought this lady's got something to say. Patricia, can you take me through some of the issues that we will be voting on in the Lisbon Treaty? Take one, go into it in detail. What effect will it have if we say yes?
Right. Well, I'd probably take the vote weighting coupled with the loss of vetoes in some areas. But just on what you were saying there in relation to politicians and what they say, the vast majority of politicians are basically just going on what their leadership have said. That's number one.
Yep.
And, you know, they haven't studied, nor do they even intend to study the treaty. And they're just taking at face value all of the assurances that have been given by the political leaders. And the other thing is, like, they are trying to undermine the credibility of the Irish as well. Like, it's not true to say that we're the laughing stock of Europe or anything like that, because, like, we have been inundated with democracy movements all over Europe, citizens movements, people who actually see this as a wonderful opportunity to address the lack of democracy in the EU, because the EU is very undemocratic even as it stands, and this thing will make it even worse again, and you can't roll back on it afterwards.
Okay.
So, like, we have a lot of groups around Europe just praying that Ireland will say no, so that they can actually have an input next time around, and that the people can be listened to for once, because they've been denied any vote on this, and it's been openly admitted, like Sarkozy and all the other heads of state have said, look, we can't let our people vote on this because they're going to reject it.
Right.
So you have to ask, well, what kind of a democracy are you building here if you're afraid to hear the voices of your people and you want to basically deny them any say? Yeah. But, I mean, on that issue of the vote weighting, up until now, you had member states had what was called like sort of a legal equality as such within the Council of Ministers. They did have different voting strengths, but it was still to a certain extent, like not great, I have to say, but it was at least better than what's being proposed in Lisbon. Lisbon, for the first time ever, they're taking population as a criteria for deciding on the voting strength of the member states. So, as I said, Germany has 80 million, huge population. So they will have a massive voting strength. Ireland has 4 million. Our voting strength is just decimated. Like, as I said, under 1%, like 0.8 of a percentage point is nothing, you know. Then the other big countries like France, Italy, the UK, they will all have huge voting strength as well, because they're about 60 million each. And the mechanism will allow for the big states, if they so wish, with a few of the smaller states supporting them, to forge ahead with anything they want. Now, what the political establishment is saying is, but this is a new system. It also includes what's called a double majority. That, in other words, it'll not just be a majority vote based on population, but that it will be a majority then of the member states. But they're not even admitting that that's already what we have. The only difference will be one. Instead of 14 member states, 15 member states, and that'll be it. Majority plus one. So really, the situation has changed dramatically in relation to how we can influence where decision making in the future.